None of them are being managed easily, and the pressures in all of these major issues are more negative. In fact, of everything that you said when you introduced me, the only thing that looks stable and consistent politically is the India election. Everything else is problematic, and so that's what they're asking me about.
All right, but maybe the first question or the issue or the concern is not the India election for all the CEOs you've been talking to.
Absolutely not.
But for our audience, this is the biggest talking point right now. And it usually begins with a number. So the assumption as per pollsters, at least before the elections began, is that we're going to have continuity, policy continuity, perhaps a third term in all likelihood of the Modi government. The question is, by how much? Now you need 273 to form a government. Does BJP get more than it did last time on its own? What's the number you guys have?
Eurasia Group is pretty consistent with where Modi and the BJP landed last time around, so it's 305 plus or minus 10 seats. My interest is not in the exact number. My interest is that of all the elections in the world this year, India, the largest democracy that is going to the ballot place, India also one of the countries with the smoothest transition. Right? There's not a lot of uncertainty about the legitimacy of the system. It is seen to be free and fair and transparent. And Modi, who has been in power now for 2 terms, is almost certainly going to be in power for another term on the back of pretty strong economic performance and consistent reform. That is, in the grand scheme of things, a very stabilizing message.
But you guys do have a number.
No, as I said, 305 plus or minus 10 is the number.
Okay,
yeah.
so 305 plus minus 10 is the number. Now, what does it mean for a third term and a political stable situation for India in terms of how the world is seeing India? I mean, right now for us, the conversation is about how India's the third largest economy sooner than later, how we are now a global power to reckon with. Is that something we're telling ourselves, or is the world also seeing it that way?
Oh, the world is definitely seeing it. The world has seen that India has underperformed for decades. India has this incredible demographic weight around the world, and they also, of course, have, very strong intellectual capital and so many STEM graduates and so many American CEOs come from India, Silicon Valley, right? And not just in the United States and Canada, all over the world. And yet India as an economy has underperformed. And now not only do we see Indian growth picking up, do we see India becoming the 4th largest economy in the world likely next year, the 3rd largest economy in the world probably by 2028. That's a big deal. But also India, as it becomes more powerful, defining itself in terms of friendship with the rest of the world, as a bridge to engage in stronger, more stable relations, as a leader of the global South, as stronger relations with the U.S., with the West. Canada's an exception. They haven't managed that well, but the rest of the G7, they've managed very effectively. And even stabilizing to a little degree, a limited degree, the Indian relationship with China in recent days. So I think not only is India seen as a more positive story, but India is also not perceived as a threat to the global stage. It's seen as a constructive part of a global economy that doesn't have many good stories like that today. So that's the reason why the West is paying attention.
In terms of how India has positioned herself, whether it was when Ukraine-Russia broke out, we continued to import Russian oil because we needed it, though it was something the West didn't necessarily like. On Israel and Gaza, we've been very clear on the humanitarian aspect of it. But we haven't really, quote-unquote, taken a side. Do you think that that's gone down well?
Well, it's funny. India, of course, is importing an enormous amount of oil from Russia, but that's completely consistent with U.S. policy. The Americans at no point wanted to cut off all oil export from Russia because it would have caused a global recession. It would have led to oil prices far higher, would have probably meant that Biden would have no chance of being president again. So it wasn't like the Americans were telling the Indians, we're very angry at you for importing this oil at a discount. by the way, so the Russians don't get quite as much profit. Same thing is true for the export of uranium or the export of food or the export of fertilizer. The revealed American preference is that the U.S. supports Ukraine, but not so much that it hurts the Americans. And India, of course, to a great degree, feels the same way. India supports Ukrainian sovereignty. India doesn't want the Russian invasion of Ukraine to continue, but India is going to keep doing business with Russia. Now, the one place that we see more strategic alignment is in the defense sector. And India is now, of course, building out its naval capabilities. It sees itself geopolitically as an island where the relations on its land borders aren't so great. But who's going to work with India to build that naval capacity? Increasingly, the United States and the West. How about in avionics, for example? How about in advanced military capabilities for Indian defense more broadly? And the spending is going up. Increasingly, the United States, including production with the Indians on the ground in India. The U.S. is paying much more attention to that, much more attention to India's membership in the Quad, much more attention to Indian alignment with the United States on broader strategic issues in Asia.
Okay. You've given me a good segue into the U.S. elections, because that's really the big one, isn't it? And does it seem likely that you are maybe going to have another Trump term? What is the best case scenario? What's the worst case scenario from the American perspective and for the rest of the world?
Well, we're 5 months away from the election in the United States. I mean, I can tell you who's going to win the Russian election in 5 months. That's not very hard. I have no idea in the United States. It's a very long time, and the U.S. is still a democracy. It's also very close. Today, Trump has an advantage, a small advantage, probably 60-40 Trump, but I have very low confidence in that projection. What I do have confidence in is that Americans increasingly don't trust the outcome. The United States is the only advanced industrial democracy today that is incapable of actually holding a free and fair election that is seen as legitimate by the whole population. Canada can do it. The UK, even after Brexit, can do it. France, even Italy, Japan, no problem. The United States cannot. U.S. democracy is in crisis, and Americans think that their political opponents domestically are trying to destroy their democracy. That's a serious problem. So whoever wins, there's going to be more anger, more polarization, more dysfunction, and probably more violence in the United States. That's not civil war, right? It's not a dictatorship, but it is the continued erosion of the most powerful country's democracy in the world. And if you are another country that views the United States as an important partner, your ability to predict how consistent the U.S. will be in its commitments to you is going to get more challenging. If you're an enemy of the United States, the room for operating in a more chaotic environment where the U.S. isn't a consistent leader is an opportunity for you. So that's the big challenge that we see with, yes, the most important U.S. election in a very, very long time.
Do you think the biggest question perhaps is, are these really our only choices? For both leaders on both sides, I mean, in terms of their capabilities, in terms of how old they are, in terms of what they represent. Do you think that's also a question in America right now?
Well, I mean, it is, again, 5 months away. These are very old men. I mean, one of them could have a major health issue in the next 5 months. We're not sure still that this is the only choice that's going. I mean, unless there's a health incident, it's going to be Biden and Trump. And they're historically unpopular leaders. Unpopular because Biden is so old, unpopular because Trump is so unfit, unpopular also because the U.S. is so polarized that nobody can do well with both sides of the political spectrum. But unfortunately, this is the election that the United States is facing, and people are going to be very, very dissatisfied with either outcome. That's what we're looking at.
What does it mean then in terms of, let me put it this way, US and China, because that then has a spillover effect on a lot of other things. So in either case, do you think the US-China relationship gets worse from here or has scope for improvement?
So the US-China relationship right now is in a period of what I would call managed decline. In other words, we know that there are challenges in the US-China relationship. We see it with $2 billion more of military aid to Taiwan. We see it with the threat of forcing TikTok to be sold away from ByteDance, the Chinese ownership. We see it with new steel tariffs, with $18 billion in tariffs announced just in the last several days. We see it with the new investigation into Chinese shipbuilding, and on and on and on. So I can give you an entire chapter and verse of how the US-China relationship is becoming worse. And yet, it is being managed. It's being managed to not spill over into a sudden crisis, to not become a Cold War. And the Americans are interested in managing the relationship more effectively because they don't want another crisis. The Chinese are interested in managing it more effectively because their economy is not doing well right now. They don't want that problem. And because geopolitically, in their own backyard here in Asia, China's relations have been losing a lot of strategic impulse to the United States. So in that regard, I do think that while the relationship between the US and China is getting worse, it's not getting worse precipitously. It is being contained. Having said that, China is one of the few foreign policies around the world that Americans generally agree on, Democrats or Republicans, in the House and Senate, Biden and Trump. And that means that Trump's policies of tariffs on China have been largely maintained and consistent under Biden. When Biden announced 100% tariffs on electric vehicles, Trump said they should be 200%. So, I mean, in a sense, they're competing to see who can be tougher on China, but Trump tried to get a deal with the Chinese, and there was still broad stability between the relations in the two countries. And if Trump became president again, that would still be true. Now, I do think that a Trump presidency would show more pressure on tariffs across the board on Chinese exports, which would mean more pressure for the Chinese to come to a deal and cry uncle, but also more pressure for the Chinese to hit back and say, we're not going to take this, and move towards a Cold War. So in other words, the status quo would be more unsettled, would be more uncertain in a Trump administration on US-China than a second Biden administration.
One fallout perhaps of COVID and maybe Trump's position on China was a lot of companies around the world looking for an alternate. So the whole China plus one, etc.
Right.
I'm interested in your assessment of how India has fared on that front, because we would have been or are a good opportunity or an option in many things, but in some things, Vietnam and Indonesia, Bangladesh took a forefront. So how do you think that played out, and is that story still playing out?
I would say for the United States, the biggest story of China plus one, and that's not the way it's described in the U.S., it is the way it's described in India. In the U.S., it's nearshoring, friendshoring, it's de-risking. Those are the terms of art you hear in America and in Europe, by example. I would say Mexico is the biggest story in the United States. A whole bunch of companies are saying they want to work with Mexico. Mexico is now the leading trade partner of the United States. China's not anymore, though, of course, a lot of that is Chinese companies and exports going through Mexico to the U.S., which is raising some political concerns. And then you talk about the Asian alternatives. India having a lot of attention because of the size of the market. Vietnam, Indonesia getting a lot of attention because of greater historic exposure of the United States and corporations accordingly. But definitely India, especially because so many of the big technology companies are now saying they want in. I mean, Apple wants in semiconductor production, now picking up in India. The India stack, developing new technology that Western corporations can engage with large numbers of well-educated coders, engineers, scientists to support that in India. That's a big deal. So I think it's tech-driven but it's not only technology. Some of it is manufacturing, some of it is outsourcing and services. India's done well on that for a long time now. I think that's going to continue.
Let's shift focus to geopolitics and with the economic impact on it. Let me start with that. So we started by saying that there are two ongoing wars, and there doesn't seem to be any end point in sight right now. What's your outlook there?
In both of these wars, the near to medium term looks worse for the West and for broad stability than one would hope. In the case of Russia-Ukraine, the Ukrainians, 6 months without military support from the United States, U.S. was dithering. They've now lost some significant territory to the Russians. They don't have adequate air defenses. The Russians are more capable of hitting them in their cities. Ukraine getting more desperate, so they're engaging in further strikes against critical infrastructure inside Russia. This is not sustainable. Long-term, Ukraine is having a harder time maintaining the territorial integrity of their state, of their government. Middle East, you've got a war which is continuing in Gaza. Hamas wants the war to continue. The Israeli government wants the war to continue. No one else in the world wants the war to continue, but the two principal adversaries do. And as long as that is true, you're going to see more proxy attacks from the Iranian so-called axis of resistance in the region, more disruptions in the Red Sea, and more broadly, perhaps the Mediterranean, perhaps the Indian Ocean, the Straits of Hormuz. All of that is a problem for global supply chain, maybe even risking direct confrontation between Israel, Iran, the United States itself. Both of these wars are not over any time in the foreseeable future.
Would it be fair to say, in a strange sense, markets at least, or businesses don't care as much? And when I say that, I mean, for example, look at crude prices. So many events, and crude prices are not moving, perhaps because they're looking at long-term demand impact, etc. Markets are still fine. U.S. markets are still fine, penciling in rate cuts, and that becomes the big pivot. Why do you think so?
Well, first of all, I don't accept the general view that the markets don't care. I think that inflation is higher and stickier today than a lot of people predicted because of the impact of the disruptions of these geopolitical forces, the real and the potential. That definitely is factoring in. You hear that from Powell, from the Fed. You hear that from the IMF and Kristalina Georgieva. You hear that from Lagarde of the ECB. Across the board, there are real geopolitical concerns that are factoring in. They're not going away. For oil price specifically, we now have prices around low 80s, which definitely does not reflect a geopolitical premium. Why? Well, one, the United States has basically become an exporter, right? I mean, massive record levels of American crude production, LNG production, making life a lot easier. Secondly, a lot of excess refining capacity in China right now, and demand is not massive around the world. So you put that together, and a couple million, 3 million plus barrels that are not on the market from OPEC. There's lots of capacity to respond to significant geopolitical tensions in the Middle East and in Russia, with refining capacity getting hit by the Ukrainians. In both of those cases, unless the wars get significantly worse, there's no reason for those oil prices to go up.
Okay. So you're saying the impact is not perhaps seen yet. Let me come to the other part.
No, it's not being seen in oil. It is being seen in inflation. That's what I'm saying.
Despite that, the assumption now is, on a very optimistic level, 2 rate cuts by the end of the year, perhaps 1 in September at least. Do you think that that's too optimistic?
The markets are now closer in line with what Eurasia Group's projections were at the beginning of this year. We were very surprised with how optimistic the markets were, with significant multiple rate cuts over the course of the year. A lot of the banking projections were incredibly just priced for perfection, implied that nothing was going to go wrong significantly on the geopolitical space, and not just in terms of conflict and war, but also in terms of the Americans, the Europeans, export controls, tariffs, all the rest. All of these are challenging for the global economy. All of these have macro implications. We now feel we're now more in line with where the markets are today. There's considerably more caution in the marketplace today than there was 6 months ago.
So a rate cut in 2024 or not, or maybe early 2025?
I'm not a market watcher, but our economists and our geoeconomic team basically think, one rate cut for the rest of the year is roughly what they're pricing in.
What is 2025 and the rest of 2024 looking like to Ian Bremmer geopolitically? If I were to ask you to put it in a few key words, instability, chaos, or getting used to the chaos?
It's not chaos, but it is an absence of guardrails containing confrontations that are bad for the world. It's an absence of effective global leadership. There's a lot of leadership around the world, but there's very little effective global leadership. I mean, the Russians invade Ukraine. No one in the world wants them to take Ukraine other than Russia and maybe Iran, North Korea, Belarus, and yet they're actually gaining momentum. Hamas hits Israel. It gets involved in this horrible, brutal war. Nobody wants that war to continue except for Israel and Hamas, and yet the war is continuing. Now, the United States militarily is far more powerful than these countries. Economically, far more powerful. The U.S. and its allies collectively, far more powerful, and yet it's not being prevented. I mean, even when President Biden goes to the Israeli prime minister, and Biden is his biggest ally, his biggest supporter, and saying, we want you to get humanitarian aid in, we want you to commit to a two-state solution, we don't want you to go into Rafah. And the Israeli prime minister says, no, not going to do it. That's what we're seeing around the world right now, is an absence of effective global leadership that leads to more instability, more challenges geopolitically, which are costs. They're costs to globalization, they're costs to the marketplace, they're costs to multinational corporations. No one is happy that we're having this many big macro conversations about geopolitical risk.
Yeah. And those risks continue. Thank you so much, Ian, for speaking with us today. We can go on and on, so much to cover, but I know we have a limited amount of time. Thank you.
Good to be with you.